Afternoon, everybody. I am joining you today from the Two Oceans Aquarium, but I am very excited about this series and about seeing all of you because literally in that lab that you're sitting now, I once sat and I eventually went on to do my master's with Doc Candy and then came to Cape Town. And I basically followed a raindrop. And so, you flow with the river into the ocean. And so I'm excited to say that we're now at the Two Oceans Aquarium to give this lecture. And we have a very fantastic presenter here today. And so Bianca Engel is 26 years with Two Oceans Aquarium. She is the head of education, and she's going to take us on a deep dive into rocky shores and sandy beaches. So with that, Bianca.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the session. We're not quite going to go on a deep dive, but we're going to definitely be walking along the rock pools and along the rocky shore and a little bit later along the sandy shore to see the different ecosystems and organisms that we find in each of those environments. So without any further ado, let me start by sharing my screen. Right, so this is the first ecosystem that we're going to be looking at in a bit more detail, the rocky shore ecosystem. And sometimes it looks like this, and other times it is covered by water. So this was at Delbrook last week when we went down to do a bit of recording. So you can see the tide slowly coming in. So this area at the moment it's at a spring low tide. So it is a little bit more revealing. But if we were to remain there for a couple of hours, that environment would be totally covered by water again. So we have high tide and low tide, right? So just as a means of getting started, what causes the tides? Any comment from the audience? What causes tides? What do you understand by that?
Hello.
Yes.
The things that cause the tide are mainly the moon. However, the sun also has an impact, as well as a slight amount of the earth rotating has an impact on the tides.
Fantastic. Yes, exactly. Exactly it. So the main cause of the tides is the moon, the gravitational force of the moon pulling the water towards it. But in addition to that, the sun also has as an additional impact on the tides, and it actually reinforces it. So I'm going to go through that a little bit. So firstly, the moon is the main reason why we have tides. And because the moon is rotating around the Earth, where the high tide is experienced is going to be changing and shifting as the moon rotates around our planet. In addition to that, as you said, the Earth rotates on its own axis, and that results for an additional high tide on the other end. So this side of the planet will experience high tide because of the gravitational pull of the moon. And on that side, that high tide is as a result of the centrifugal force. And so when we add the effect or the impact of the sun as well, then we have an additional increase in the height of the tide. So the first is when we have the sun, the moon, and the earth in a straight line. And that usually occurs at new moon and full moon. And essentially the sun and the moon actually increases the height of the high tide and also results in the lowest of the low tide. So the impact that we see in spring tide is a very, very high tide and a very, very low tide. So that's just a little bit exaggerated. The rest of the time, we then experience what we call neap tide. So when the earth and the moon and the sun is sort of perpendicular to each other, then the gravitational force of the moon against the water body on our planet and the gravitational force that the sun exerts actually sort of cancels each other out. So it's not as amplified as what we see at a spring tide. So essentially what we have then is the following. So at a spring tide, we've got the highest range in terms of tides, so tidal range. So highest high tide and the lowest of the low tide. And at a neap tide, we have what we call so a high low tide and a low high tide. Bit confusing, I know. But what that has a great impact on the animals, the organisms that we find in this rocky shore ecosystem, because you'll find that they start actually situated in various bands on the rocky shore intertidal zone, depending on how they can cope with those different conditions. So this is another video clip that I'm going to play. I think it's the same one that we showed earlier on, but this time I want you to consider the challenges that these organisms might have to deal with. So what are some of the challenges?
One of the challenges would be the wave action pushing them away, and
Yes,
so they have
definitely.
to lodge.
Mm-hmm.
A different one is because they don't have water all the time or less water at certain times. They're more threatened by water loss.
Mm-hmm. Desiccation, right? Can you think of any others?
I'm trying to remember them now.
No worries. Okay, so consider that in some of these areas, you're going to have a collection of water in a rock pool. So what would happen to the organisms or the water in that rock pool if it's exposed at low tide?
Well, if there's no new oxygen coming in, they'll use up all the oxygen.
Yeah, so less oxygen possibly. Yeah. Anything else? You've got the sun's effect on this water body. So what would happen to that water in the little rock pool?
Because of the sun shining on it, on that rock pool, the water might evaporate up as well.
Okay, prior to evaporation, what would happen?
Sorry?
Prior to evaporation, what would happen to the water?
The water would heat up.
Water heats up. Now, this is taken in along the west and the south coast, right? The west and the south coast. And so here we have the Atlantic Ocean, so cold Benguela current. So the temperature here is usually between 9 and 15 degrees Celsius. So the water can heat up quite significantly in those rock pools. So for these animals, it's a big temperature shift. So big temperature challenge as well. So from very, very cold when they're covered by water to a bit more warmer when they are exposed at low tide, right? And yes, quite right, the water evaporates. And so there's less water in those rock pools, but what is left behind if the water evaporates from the rock pools?
Sediment.
Sediment, yeah. What else?
Salinity.
Yes, salt content, salinity. Yes, fantastic. So salinity. So salinity would also increase, right? So particularly those rock pools that are closer to the shore and that are out of water for a long period of time, the salinity would increase quite dramatically for these organisms. So one other thing, so just showing the impact of wave action in the water itself for these animals and plants particularly. And one other that is not as obvious is that along with the waves coming in, they actually push sediment into these rock pools. And so that could result in the animals being covered by sand. So sand inundation in the rock pool specifically, or in certain lower areas, is also a challenge for some of these organisms. Okay, I'm going to show some of these videos again a bit later, but just to indicate or show how these animals are now being covered by sand or sediment because of the incoming tide that brings in a lot of additional sediment along with it. Right, so the abiotic factors, just to highlight them again, we've mentioned those already. So desiccation, drying out, so they're exposed at low tide. And along with that, oxygen would be used up quite significantly as well, so low oxygen content. Temperature extremes, so as I was mentioning, in those rock pools, the water heats up at high tide, at low tide, and at high tide, they are covered by water, and so they are covered by this cold water coming from the Atlantic Ocean. So big temperature extremes. Wave action, you pointed out earlier on already. Salinity, so not only is the water evaporating and heating up, but what is left behind is a higher salt content. So particularly those rock pools closer to the shore are going to be a little bit more saline than those closer to where the waves are breaking. And lastly, sand inundation. So besides these abiotic factors that we spoke of, or that we highlighted, there are other challenges as well, and that's relating to animal and plant interactions, so biological interactions, biological factors. And so quick video to point out one or two of that already. So the seagull is picked up a piece of a mussel shell or a limpet and flies up into the air and drops it. So breaks it and cracks it open so that it can get to the nice soft body parts. So predation is a big thing, one of the big interactions. And it's not just only predators from land, but also predators from the ocean. So at high tide, when it's covered by water, various marine organisms might also come into this environment and prey on animals and plants that reside there. In the rock pools and on the rocks itself, there is very limited space. And so you have competition for food and competition for space, as well as reproductive mates as well. So all of those interspecies and intraspecific competition also applies in this environment. So just once again, just highlighting those again. So biotic factors, so that's the interaction between the animals and plants in that environment. So it's either competition for space and food availability, and then predation from both land as well as from the ocean itself. Right, so because these organisms might be more suited to live high up on the shore and can maybe not deal too well with wave action, they might occur around this area, or those that can perhaps deal with a lot of wave action are found closer to where the waves are breaking. So we can divide this environment into a number of zones based on the indicator species in those environments. So above the high water mark, that's referred to as the supertidal zone or the supratidal zone. Between the tides, so between the high tide mark and the low tide mark, that's the intertidal zone. And then below the lowest point that the low tide goes to, that is the subtidal zone. And you find very similar organisms that you find in this area in the rock pools as well, because it's similar kind of environment as well. And then, as mentioned, there we have within the intertidal zone, we have these specific zones. So zonation is based on the most abundant animal that we find in a particular area. So the first zone is the Littorina zone. Then we have the upper Balanoid zone, lower Balanoid zone, and the Cochlear zone. So this, by the way, is the intertidal, or the zonation rather, for the south and the west coast of South Africa. I understand that you visited KZN, so you would have seen and experienced the East Coast zonation. So what differences, other than these that I've pointed, what other additional zone did you encounter?
We encountered the oyster belt. Yes.
Ah, yeah, so the oyster belt, right, fantastic. Okay, and zoanthids, did you see a lot of zoanthids as well?
Yes, we did. We saw zoanthids. Yes.
Okay, so zoanthids and oyster belt, which is one of the areas that we don't have here along the west and the south coast. Okay, so starting with the Littorina zone. So when we get into this area, the reason it's named the Littorina zone is because the most abundant and the indicator species that is found in this area is the Littorina snails. Their scientific name is Afrolittorina africanus, and it has gone through a number of changes. So I think that's the most recent one. And so it's these tiny, tiny little snails that we find in this particular area. And so remember, this area is only covered by water at a spring high tide, which occurs approximately every 2 weeks. And so that means that for the most part, they are out of water. And so they are air-breathing animals, air-breathing mollusks, and so they prefer to be out of water. And because they're out of water, they also, during the day, they're going to be exposed to a lot of sunlight. And so a lot of potential desiccation in this environment. And so some of the ways in which they kind of deal with that as a challenge is you can see that they're all packed in these little cracks and crevices, okay, where there's a little bit more shade. In addition to that, they also secrete a bit of slime from their muscular foot. That then hardens onto the surface, and they then lift up their shell and their foot, so they're not directly attached onto the hot, dry surface. And so that reduces the amount of heat that they lose and water that they lose through their foot and through their body. So this is just a closer view of them. And this is a video clip that we took just to show you the size. And also how barren this area looks, other than the fact that once you go closer to the rocks, you actually then start seeing these tiny, tiny little snails. Okay, so Littorina zone is named after the presence of this particular snail. In addition to that, you might also find this particular seaweed. It's called purple lava, or porphyra is its scientific name, its genus name. And it looks sort of like lava flowing on the rocks, hence the name. Purple because apparently it does have a bit of a purplish tinge to it if you hold it up to the light. And these seaweeds are also able to stay out of water for up to 2 weeks. And essentially looks like dried black plastic, if you look at it a little bit more closer. But when you look at it a little bit more closer and lift up the top layers, you then find that the layers underneath are still quite moist. And so that helps it to retain a bit of moisture so that it can still do the life processes that is required of this particular seaweed. Incidentally, it is a red algae, and usually red algae are found deep in the ocean. So this is one of those exceptions that is found high up on in the intertidal zone. So if I were to dry these out for 2 weeks or more and put it back in the water, it will actually take up that moisture again and still be able to photosynthesize as previously. Right. Now, how many of you like eating sushi? I can't see your screen, so I'm assuming that there's a lot of hands being raised. So if you've ever eaten sushi, the black around these areas, that is actually purple lava that has been processed. But you can actually harvest them, if you have a permit though, harvest them fresh off the rocks. And I've got some here, fresh off the rocks, and it is edible as is. Bit of meaty taste, well, that's my perception of it, but also very, very nutritious. And next, we're going to the upper balanoid zone. So balanus comes from the word balanus, which is referring to barnacles. And so the most abundant species in this particular area, or the indicator species here, is the barnacles. And along the coastline, we actually have a number of different species of barnacles that we find in the intertidal zone. So these are a few of them: the acorn barnacle, the volcano barnacle, and the H-shelled barnacle. So those are some of the species of barnacles that we have here. So this is what they look like when they are exposed at low tide. Right. And not many people get to see what they actually look like. So I've got a little video clip taken from our microscope here at the aquarium. And this is what it looks like when it's covered by water. And so what you're seeing, viewing there at the moment, is its foot. So these animals are related to the crabs and your crayfish. But unlike those animals, those arthropods that are mobile around, these are, once they settle, they metamorphose into this particular structure. So they create their own shell, they metamorphose, submit themselves head first onto the surface, and their legs now become adapted to these filtering structures. So what you're seeing is actually their legs. So if you can imagine this animal upside down, head on the surface, legs up in the water, and moving and combing the water for food. That's essentially what you're seeing. So they're filter feeders. So when they are in the water, or rather in the water, they would extend the cirri, that's that structure, and they'll move that in the water to feed. And when they're out of the water, they will close off the plates, and that then seals them off. Twofold, it protects them, and secondly, also it helps trap a bit of moisture whilst they are out of water at a low tide. So another organism that we find in this particular area, we start seeing them, is the sea lettuce, Sciacia in Afrikaans. And as the name implies, these particular plants can be used for cooking. So you can either have it as part of a salad. I was told by our recent crop of volunteers that you can use that instead of using salt. So dried pieces of sea lettuce, you can add that to food, and that adds a bit of salt into your cooking. So with the sea lettuce and the purple lava, they are extremely thin. And so these particular plants, while they can deal with desiccation, drying out, they can't deal with wave action. And so that's another reason why you're going to find them high up on the shore. They're more suited to be found in that particular area as opposed to where the waves are breaking, like in this particular video that we've just viewed. So the lower balanoid zone, yes, you guessed it, has a lot of barnacles, but in addition to that, we also sometimes find a lot of mussels in this particular area as well. So it's a combination of barnacles and mussels, as well as lots more seaweed in this particular area. So lots more variety of seaweed. And so I'm just going to point out a couple of the seaweed that we also find in this area. So this is the hanging rack. Beyond that is the kelp, and that we usually find in more the subtidal area. But my absolute favorite to talk to people about is this particular plant. It's called the dead man's fingers. I haven't quite found out why they call it dead man's fingers, other than the fact that it looks like fingers, and that if they are out of water, they shrivel up. So it looks like you have spent your day in the bath, and when your fingers get very wrinkly, that is essentially what the dead man's fingers look like when they are out of water. So if you take a tip of the dead man's fingers and you give it a bit of a squeeze, a bit of mucus comes out of that. That's slime. That slime is actually around the cells. And so when these these plants rather are out of the water, they lose the moisture around the cells and not directly from the cells itself. And so that does help reduce the impact of desiccation in this particular seaweed's case. And incidentally, I've been told that if you forget your suntan lotion at home and you are in need of some sunscreen, then you can use the dead man's fingers, the slime in the dead man's fingers, and apply that on your skin. So still within the lower balanoid, but now looking at some organisms that we might find in some rock pools in those areas. So you can clearly see, hopefully, that there are some sea urchins in this environment. Just going to play the front bit as well again. Okay, besides the dead man's fingers, another favorite of mine to point out is this particular seaweed. It's called a tongue seaweed. And I guess the reason why it's called tongue seaweed is because it's shaped like a tongue, and also the structures that you see on the seaweed itself looks like taste buds. So the papillae on the surface to increase the surface area does possibly resemble that of a tongue, and it feels a bit like a cat's tongue. So hence the name tongueweed. But I absolutely love the Afrikaans name for this particular seaweed. It's called Pacysblaar. Pacysblaar. Pimpleweed, for those of you that are not Afrikaans speakers. In and amongst the sea urchins, there are some sea anemones. So in the left-hand corner at the bottom, this is a sea anemone. And then this structure over here is actually the top of a worm. It's the head of a worm called a feather duster worm. Okay. And when we touch it, it retracts. So that's its tube that it creates. And then these are some sea anemones that are out of the water. And so they've now retracted their tentacles entirely. But along the side, what the other thing we wanted to just point out is this is what the tube of the worm looks like. They do occur in different colors, as you see over here. And so that is their modified head, ideal for filtering the surrounding water. So they filter feeders. But in addition to that, they are also taking up a lot of oxygen out of the surrounding water column as well. So it's twofold. Okay, once again, having a look at some sea urchins, but in and amongst the sea urchins, those black things that you see, that's the head or the top of the sea cucumbers. So the rest of the body is under the water itself. And the sea urchins generally do not like being under lots of light. And so usually are in rock pools, under rock crevices, and where there's not enough shade, they pick up whatever is available around them. So in this particular video, they picked up seaweed and shells. But while we were doing some exploring at the rock pools, we also found some that were covered by plastic. And that's just an indication of the state of our environments as well. So not only were they using the natural structures that are found in this environment, so shells and tubes of the worms and seaweed as well, but they were also picking up pieces of plastic on top and holding that on top of their body. I think this is a good time for me to switch over. So I have a little bit of some live organisms that I want to show you, and one of those is in fact a sea urchin. So let me just put it into view over there. Okay, and bring it a little bit more closer so we can see some of its details. Okay, I don't know how many of you have actually touched a sea urchin before. So those prickly bits are the spines, that's for protection. The parts that you see moving around very frantically, those are all their feet, the tube feet. And that's what they use to hold on tightly onto the surface, as well as to move around with and sense the environment. And then this particular seaweed is, or sorry, sea urchin is covered by a piece of sea lettuce. So I'm going to take the sea lettuce off it. So in this case, it's using it not just only for food, but it will also use it for protection from the light, direct light. Okay, so that structure on top in the middle, that is its anus. So its anus is on the top and the mouth is underneath the animal. And it makes sense for this organism because as they're moving on this rocks, they are feeding on the various seaweeds that they encounter. And so their mouth is underneath, and as it goes through their digestive system, whatever they can't process and use will be ingested through the anus, which is on the top. So in terms of this particular animal, so while we have the sea urchin underneath this visualized at the moment, the tube feet are transparent. So they have water inside their body. They don't have blood. They've got a hydrovascular system, as you may recall. And so they are able to extend the tube feet and retract it in order to help them move. As you can see, this animal's moving right now at the moment. Doesn't like being in the minimal amount of light that I do have across it. And so they would try and when they're out of water, they'll retract those 2 feet entirely. If they dead, what remains is what we call a sea pumpkin. So a little bit later in the session, I'll show you what the sea pumpkin looks like. Okay. So while we're still on here, so I don't have to swap over too much. Okay, so there's the sea anemone. I will feed it a little bit in a few minutes time, so that you can see how it feeds. So these are its tentacles around here. Tentacles around here. They only have one single opening, right? So that opens up into the gastrovascular cavity, and whatever they cannot use will then be expelled through that same opening. So they only have a mouth, just one single opening. And then within the tentacles, they would capture, they have specific cells called stinging cells or nematocysts, and that's what they would use to paralyze their prey as well as to capture it, as well as to protect themselves against would-be predators in this environment. So they might look like pretty flowers, but they are really dangerous organisms in these rock pools. You can see some things flitting around in the water. So that's some food that I fed them a little bit earlier on. They're called brine shrimp. And if it comes a little bit too close to the tentacles, it will be paralyzed and then brought into the center and eaten and consumed alive. Right, the next section or the next zone that we look at is called the cochlea zone, and it's named after the presence of this particular limpet. This limpet is called, commonly referred to as a pear-shaped limpet. Its scientific name is Scutellastria cochlea, hence the name cochlea zone. And previously, this is one of the interesting limpets. Previously, it was referred to as the patellar cochlea. So this is classification in action, where it has changed names within the past couple of years because of more knowledge about these particular species. So this is the most dominant organism within this particular area. You can see that they cover this entire stretch, so much so that they occupy this entire area, and there's not that many other organisms that can reside in this environment. So if I zoom in a little bit closer, on here, there's another little limpet on top of a big adult one. So because there's not that much space which they can occupy, they're not only going to be using the actual rock surfaces, but they might also attach on top of the other limpets as well. So the interesting thing about this particular limpets are mollusca, and they are herbivores. So they have their own little garden of algae. So this reddish structure around it is a specific algae usually associated with this particular limpet. And this limpet actually gardens and looks after its own little garden of algae, of red algae. And so as they are feeding, they will eat and feed, make little crevices between or tracks within this algae. In addition to that, as that happens, it actually increases the amount of area where the algae can actually just expand and grow. And if another limpet comes a little bit too close, they will fend off those limpets. So they actually have these little fencing matches where they will push the other limpet away. So they are essentially competing for food and space within this environment. So we showed this video clip earlier, but this is now focusing on the fact that this area is the cochlear zone, and it's covered with all of these limpets. We do find some additional algae, but if they're on the rock surface directly, they're going to be eaten by the limpets occurring in here. So there are some of the algae that actually settle on top of the limpets to avoid being preyed on. And here you can see a couple of smaller limpets on top of the bigger pear-shaped limpet, just occupying whatever space it can find. Okay, so now we get into the subtidal environment. Subtidal environment. So here we have a lot of kelp. You're going to find kelp in this environment. All of your anemones and urchins, as well as sea anemones, and various kinds of sea stars in this particular environment as well. But just focusing on the kelp, the lowest part of the kelp that's attached directly onto the rocks, it's not a root system. It's called a hold fast, because that's exactly what it does. It attaches itself onto the rocks and ensures that it doesn't get washed away by the wave action. And then we have the stipe, and the stipe is hollow, and so that ensures that the seaweed remains buoyant so that they can reach the surface, and that also ensures that they are able to photosynthesize. And then on top, close to the top part of the plant, there's a air bladder. So again, once more filled with air. And then the blades, or what we would generally refer to as the leaves, those are just several of those blades, a lot of them all together. They're really, really tough. And so they can withstand a lot of wave action in this particular environment. So just to show you how strong they are, this is a video clip that we took when we were at the beach. And I was going to attempt to pull it off the rocks. So that's the structure, the stipe and the air bladder, all of the fronds and the end. And just to show you that the fronds there's plenty of them, and they broad, so to increase the surface area so that there's more photosynthesis occurring. And I'm trying to tug it off the rocks, and so it really doesn't come off that easily. Okay, so that's the base of a holdfast that had the rest of the plant broke off. And on that holdfast, what I was pointing out at is a colonial ascidian. Just to show you once again how difficult it is to actually pull that off. So I mentioned earlier on that the sea urchins don't like being under direct light, and usually they would be under rocks, in the rock pools, or if there's not a lot of shade available for them, they'll pick up whatever they find. So these are some sea urchins that not only have some algae on top of it, but also a piece of plastic as well. And yes, we did remove the plastic from that environment. So still in the subtidal environment, on the sort of the edges of the rocks that we find in this particular intertidal zone. So just on the edge, just as it spills into the subtidal zone, into the rock pools, we often find a whole group or clump of these particular organisms. They're called red bait. Okay, it's a kind of solitary ascidian. So I'm giving it a bit of squeeze to show you the other common name it's known by, which is sea squirt. So at a spring low tide, if you get to see this particular environment, you sometimes see that they actually would release a bit of the water through their siphons. So they've got these two openings, one on this side, one in the other side, one through which they'll take water in and filter the surrounding water for foods. They filter feeders. And the other opening through which they will release their water, their waste products through. So they are filter feeders, and they are part of the same phylum that you and I are part of, the chordates. So they might not look like much, but they are very close relatives of us. Right, so I'm going to then just go quickly look at a few other organisms that we got to see at the beach and the intertidal zone. And this is definitely a favorite of mine to look out for. And that's the sea stars. And I said sea stars, not starfish, because they are not biologically fish. So they should really be referred to as sea stars. They are part of the group of echinodermata, which incidentally just refers to the fact that their skin is rather rough. So there are different species that we find along our west and our south coast. The green one is a cushion star, a dwarf cushion sea star. The other is a red sea star. And then these are spiny sea stars. You can see that they have a very spiny covering on their body as well. So how many arms does a sea star usually have?
Sea stars usually have 5 arms, but they can have up to, I think, 25.
Right. They can have multiples. So usually 5 or multiples of 5. And so what kind of symmetry do they usually have?
They have the radial symmetry of the 5 points.
Okay, so penta meaning 5 and radial referring to most organisms that have a circular body plan. So penta-radial symmetry. So we can divide them into sort of 5 parts, and each of those parts are exactly the same. And so one of the key characteristics of this group, besides the fact that they've got the spiny skin, is that they have penta-radial symmetry, and also tube feet that they use to move around with and attach with, as well as being able to regenerate any of its limbs. So if the limbs are broken off, like in this case, they are able to regrow it. And so yeah, you can already see a bit of growth occurring. Okay, doesn't happen immediately, takes a bit of time, and it's never going to be the exact length of the previous arms, but they are capable of regrowing those arms. So when I am usually teaching a group of students at the aquarium, I often ask them, does this animal have a head? And some would indicate that maybe on the tip of the arm is the head, or in the center is the head, but in fact this animal does not have a head at all. It does, however, have eye spots on the tip of each of the arms. So the top left image was taken under our microscope. That red dot in the center is its eye spot. It's extremely sensitive to light, but it can also detect the difference between where there's lots of bright light and where there's a bit of shade or shadow. And so they prefer to be in more darker environments. So they move towards those environments more so. Underneath their arms, they've got these tube feet, and similarly to the sea urchin, who they're related to, those tube feet operate via a hydrovascular system. And so they are able to use that to move around with, to hold on, and to feel around, sense the environment as well. They've got a very unusual way of eating. Okay, so this particular sea star, the spiny sea stars, were recorded in the aquarium, one of our exhibits areas. And so these are the spiny sea stars. And I'm just going to start the video again. So I want to point out some things. So on the tip of the arms, there's specialized tube feet that helps it to sense the environment, to pick up chemicals in the water, and sort of to taste the environment. And that helps it moves around. Underneath, there are the tube feet that they use to hold on tightly with and to move around with. Now, remembering that these animals are found in areas where there's lots of wave action, so they're needing to be able to hold on very firmly. And we placed a bit of food in this environment, so this animal in the foreground has now found food. It's lifted up its body a bit and pushed out its stomach. So essentially how they feed is they extrude their stomach through their mouth over their food, digest their food externally, and once they're done, they bring their stomach back into their body. So that is in essence what the animal was doing. Okay, I'm going to move ahead because I'm going to show some of these to you in the classroom as well. So your teacher just asked me to, your lecturer asked me just to point out Donax, so the chitin, the giant chitin. And so this was the one that we found. So these are the shell plates that forms the shell of this particular animal. It's called a chitin. And they usually have these 8 shell plates overlapping that forms the structure. Some other cool animals that we find in this environment, well, I think they're cool, are your winkles. These are your herbivorous sea snails or mollusks. So they move across the environment looking for algae, and that's what they would feed on with their radula, rasping tongue. And then the whelk is really a very interesting animal. They are carnivores. So what they do is they feed on a number of other mollusks. So they'll feed on winkles, on limpets, and even sea urchins as well. And they'll move over the animal. They will secrete a bit of acid over the organism, so to soften the shell. And then they will push out their proboscis. And the proboscis leads to their mouth, and the proboscis also has within it a single sharp spear-like radula. So in this instance, they don't have the radula, the rasping tongue any longer. They now have the spear. And so once the shell or the area is softened, they then will start drilling a hole into the shell. And so if you ever gone walking along the beach and you picked up some shells with perfect holes drilled in it, then the animal that was responsible for that would have been a whelk. And so these are some of the carnivorous animals. All of them, when they are out of water or when they're disturbed, if you lift them out of the water, they'll pull their foot into their shell, and attached onto the foot, they've got this trap door, and that seals off the shell entirely. And so that helps to reduce the amount of water loss if they're out of water, but also to help protect them from would-be predators as well. And last but not least, we were looking for these at the rock pools when we went out to Dalebrook last week, but we were not fortunate to find any. However, I do have a recording which I am sharing with you. So watch closely at the crab in the far corner. You see that? Okay. So that was a octopus. I think I cut this, trimmed it a little bit too much. But I actually put the camera into the water to actually see the octopus hiding underneath the rock crevices. So octopi like eating anything with a hard shell, so they'll feed on a variety of mollusks, but also crabs. And so this was looking and hunting for a bit of food. And unfortunately for it, the crab escaped. Or luckily for the crab escaped. But unfortunately for the octopus, it didn't get a meal in this particular case. So the black stuff I pointed out earlier to you, the head of that's the sea cucumbers, also related to the sea urchins and the sea stars, part of the echinoderms. And that's the head of the animal. So those are feeding, specialized tube feet that are now feeding tentacles, and they are filtering the surrounding water, capturing food with those sticky tentacles. And they'll pull it into their mouth, clean it of its food, apply another bit of mucus or slime on it, and then extend it back into the environment again. I am now going to go into the classroom because I want to show you some other organisms in here, and you're welcome to ask questions as we go along. So starting off with some tongueweed, you can see the shape of the tongueweed. So it looks like a tongue and it's covered with all of these bumpy bits that reminded the person that named it of taste buds. And so they're very rough, very hardy, and so definitely can withstand a lot of wave action. So hence, that's why it is found in your lower balanoid area, where there's a little bit more wave action occurring there. As opposed to the purple larvae that I pointed out earlier, far more thin, very, very thin, not going to deal with a lot of wave action at all. And so it's found high up on the shore and only covered sort of every 2 weeks during a spring high tide. The other one I pointed out to you was the dead man's fingers. Love saying it. And then if you squeeze a bit of the tip, there's the mucus coming out. And that's what you can apply to your screen, to your skin for a bit of sunscreen if you forget any of that at home. Okay, moving on into this intertidal or similar kind of environment, what we find in our subtidal environment. So this is a closer view of the donax, the chitin, the giant chitin. And so these are the 8 plates. They belong to the class Polyplacophora. And so holding all of that together is this girdle, leather girdle around here. And underneath that, they've got a very big muscular foot, a small little head, and within the head or the mouth region, they've got a radular tongue, which is what they use to feed on any encrusted algae and other organisms in this area. So they do grow rather big, and they're often in the rock pools, they are covered by sand. So you don't often get to see the entire structure of the animal. And then we've got a couple of sea anemones in here. And so as I mentioned earlier on, they've got this sort of body, sort of tubular body. They've got one single foot with which they are attaching onto the rock directly, a single opening in the middle, and surrounding that mouth is all of these tentacles that are filled with nematocysts. So if we touch it, we feel that it feels a bit sticky. And fortunately for us, nothing happens to us because our skin is quite thick, so we don't feel the effect of those stinging cells or the nematocysts. But if you were to be a small fish and you're swimming a little bit too close, you'd be stung, paralyzed, and eaten up alive. Nice and gruesome. So just another one over here. These are sandy anemones. And so they are often found quite close to each other. And you can see how it's sticking onto my fingers. Okay. And yeah, right. Then the kelp. I wanted to point out the structures of the kelp to you again. So there's the holdfast, and within this holdfast, this actually creates a small little micro ecosystem. So there's some tube worms, there's other little organisms that are found in between here. So one of the activities we often do at the aquarium is we have holdfasts that we dissect to uncover all of the smaller organisms in here. And that is really fun to look at. This orange bits on the surface, those are soft coral that is now a bit retracted. Nothing else I can see at the moment in this instance. But coming off the holdfast, so this would be attached directly onto the rocks, and then this is the stipe. Can see it's quite tough. Okay, and if I were to cut this open, usually it would be quite hollow, and it's filled with gas and air. So that is to ensure that it remains upright so that the plant can reach the top. And that's essential for these particular seaweeds because they live in your subtidal area and beyond, up to about a depth of 30 meters or so. So they needing to get to the sunlight. And so that's one of the reasons why the stipe is filled with air to remain, to keep it being buoyant. And then the fronds itself, nice and broad, so big surface area, very slimy as well, and very, very tough. Okay, so once again, able to deal with very strong wave action in this particular environment. And then the sea stars, last but not least, I want to point out some of these features to you a little bit more closer. So you can see the bumpy surface of the animal, okay, hence why it's called echinodermata, echinos referring to hedgehog skin. And then on the tip of the arms, they've got the specialized tentacles that help to sense the environment. And at the tip, as I pointed out to you, the image under the microscope, that is eye spots. So it helps them to determine the variety of environments that you can go into. This black dot on the top is not its eye. It is its sieve plate. So that is what it uses to draw water into its structure and to maintain the water within the tube feet. So that's where they draw water in through. Underneath, if I turn it upside down, in the center, in the middle is its mouth. And you can slowly start seeing the tube feet coming out of these grooves. Okay. And as mentioned early on, the way in which they feed, some of them are herbivores, some of them are omnivores. And so the way in which they feed is they push out their stomachs through their mouth. It covers their food. Digestion takes place externally, and then they bring their stomach back into their body. And that concludes my session.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Are there any questions from the students in the classroom for Bianca?
I don't think they have anything regarding the rocky shores. I think most of them, I'm not sure, they don't look like they have a question, but I know some of them have some questions regarding the sandy beaches when we do the sandy beaches.
Yeah,
Okay, that's fine. Any about the animals itself?
I can just say that it's the first time that I've actually seen the eyes of the sea stars. So that was quite.
Well, I'm glad I was able to share that with you.
I just want a quick question. The
Yeah.
Sorry, the things with the spines, I forgot what they're called. The urchins, yes.
Sea urchins, yeah.
The sea urchins, their tube feet looked very similar to the sea stars ones. Are they also part of the Echinodermata group?
100%, yes. Well spotted. So
Thank
that's definitely one of the things that they have in common. Mainly, it's the spiny skin. So it's obviously far more observant in your sea urchins. They a different class to the sea stars. So they have these big spines. And in the case of your sea stars, it's a sort of a rough skin and sometimes little small spines on the skin if you were to look at it under the microscope a little bit more in detail. But in addition to that, the other key feature is obviously the pentaradial symmetry. So it's not as obvious as it's not as obvious in not as obvious when we look at the sea urchin, but in fact they actually still do have pentaradial symmetry. I'm just quickly going to go and get a test. So that's the internal shell or internal skeleton of the animal when it's dead, and do something cool. Okay, so this is what the shell looks like. I'm going to show it on this. Yeah. Okay, so that's what the shell looks like. And I'm going to switch over, just share with a visualizer to see if we can see a bit more detail. Okay, so that's what the shell looks like. So that's why this animal is often referred to as a sea pumpkin. Sea pumpkin because the shell looks like a pumpkin. Where you see the spots or the dots, that's where the spines are attached. And so they're on a ball and socket joint. And then in between there are little openings, and that's where the tube feet and other pedicelaria will be extending through. So they've got some other details that you can't really see unless it's under the microscope, is that besides the tube feet and the spines, they've got little nippers or pedicelaria that they use to clean their surface and to protect themselves as well. And a cool thing, if you've ever picked up one of these shells, is you put your phone on torch mode and turn your phone upside down and put the shell on top of the light. And then you'll start seeing the light shining through where these structures are. So the light will come through in those openings. And that then reinforces the fact that they've got pentaradial symmetry, because you can clearly see double rows of those areas where the tube feet will extend. Oh, wow.
Bianca, it's Candice.
Yes, hi,
Candice. I will not have a question. It's just based more a comment when we were on the rocky shore there at Treasure Beach. What I did notice, and it's more or less like the zonation in the book of the Living Shores, is that there are 3 different species of Littorina. occurring on the in the high shore on the rocks there. So it's actually quite interesting. They also actually even look a bit different to
Okay.
the ones on the south and the west coast. So I find that quite interesting, and they have very they're more in these little crevices within the rocks that have eroded around them. So they're very well protected in those areas. So that well, for me it was quite interesting to see this.
Yeah. And then algae, did you notice quite like I pointed out quite a number of different species of algae that we find here along the south and the west coast. What was your experience? And this is not just only to you, but the students as well. What was your observation there?
There was a quite significant amount of algae, but I don't know enough about the other coasts to compare them.
Yeah. Okay. So there would be a variety of species, but you would generally find that they are small. They're not as big as these big kelp plants and other seaweed that we have occurring along our coastline here. And also quite tough. A lot of them are calcified as well. So that's the other kind of general observation that I'm aware of. But I thought maybe you had picked up on something else.